All right, what I want to talk about next is a problem related to repetitive code. And to motivate that, I want to look at this sample.py file that I've got up here. This is a very boring file. You'll see where this is going here. So what I have is a file that has 3 functions in it. I have an add method, I have sub, I have mul. Again, not very interesting functions, but I want to keep them simple. Let's say I wanted to take this code and add logging to it. Like I wanted to add like a logging message to every single one of those functions. One of the ways that you could do that is I could add a print statement or something to every single function. I could come in here and say, well, okay, you're calling add, and now you're calling sub, and now you're calling mul. And by doing that, I magically get some logging added to it. It's almost so uninteresting, I hesitate to do it, but let's make sure that it works here. So we have our functions with logging on it. Now, here's the problem with doing that. It is really annoying to have to go through and manually add that to every single function like that. Imagine I had a program that had 500 functions in there. Am I going to go through every single function and add a print statement to it? It actually gets a little bit worse than that. Let's say I did that, and then I decided I was going to go show this code to my coworkers, and then they start yelling at me. They're like, Dave, why did you use print? Use the logging module or something. So I would have this problem of, like, let's say I had to change all the code to do like logging calls or something, like log debug or something. This is going to be extremely annoying, right? I have to go back and change my code in hundreds of places. Even after I make that change, somebody might later come along and say, Dave, what is this calling add message? That's useless. Change the message, like make it print out what the arguments are or something. So I'm getting into this like maintenance nightmare, basically, where I've got this code related to logging that's been added in there, but I don't like the fact that it's just repeated all over the place. And so this is a well-known problem in programming, this idea of not repeating yourself or avoiding the idea of repeating yourself. And so one of the ways that we can solve this problem is to use this idea of making code that we did in section 11, and also this idea of wrapper functions. Here's the kind of interesting thing that I could do. I could take this code and generalize it. Let me do that. I'm going to go over to the other window here. I'm going to make a file called log call. And what I'm going to do is write a function in here called logged. The idea on this function is that you're going to give me a function, and I'm going to make a wrapper layer around it. So the idea is, give me a function, I'll put logging around it. And so here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to write a wrapper, and I'm going to use the **args convention. This is a function that takes any inputs. And what I'll do is I'll put my little logging message in there. I'll say, okay, well, you're calling this thing called func. Every function knows its name, so I'm going to print that out. And then what I'll do is call the original function. I'm making a little wrapper here. I'm putting the print statement, calling the original function, and then I'm going to return that wrapper back. Okay, so I've got this new thing that I'm doing where I'm putting a wrapper around a function. Here's how that is going to work. If I were to define a function, like let's say I define a function add, just kind of in the normal way. If I wanted to put logging on it, what I could do is use this logged function that I just made. I could say, well, actually add, you're equal to this logged operation of add. What I'm doing is I'm actually replacing you with this like wrapper layer. So what happens is add turns into this wrapper function. And then if you call it, you're going to magically find that that print statement has been added to the function. I can use this with any function. Like if I had a sub function, I could take sub and I could say, well, okay, you're a logged version of sub. And like all of a sudden it has the print message on it as well. There's a number of benefits of doing it this way. One of the benefits is the logging has been isolated to one place. This is solving the problem of me changing the logging. Like if I needed to change the message or the way that logging works, I've kind of put it in one location, not being cut and pasted across the code. On the other hand, it's still a little bit weird. I mean, one of the things that I have to do is I have to wrap my functions manually. So like if I were going to use that code in the code over on the left, I would have to do something like this, from log call import log, and then I would have to define each function and then replace it with kind of a logging wrapper. I would have to do something like that. Looks a little weird, but we're going to see a better way to do this in a second. Again, the idea is I'm using the ability to generate code to try and simplify this logging task. This is actually what decoration is in Python. The idea of taking a function and putting a wrapper layer around it is really said to be decorating the function. What I'm doing is taking a function and adding some kind of new feature to it, decorating it. And it's so common that there's special syntax for kind of cleaning up this whole definition process. This problem of defining the function and then immediately kind of wrapping it with this layer that looks a little weird. So what you can do instead is use the @ sign. Turns out that if you use @ like if I say @log, this is the same as defining the function and then wrapping it. It allows me to get rid of that final step. So I can come in here, I can sort of tag these functions, sort of saying, okay, all of you guys, you're logged. And they will magically get logging added to it. Just to maybe see this in action, I'm going to put a print statement in here, just adding logging to the function name, just so you can see when this thing runs here. So what is going to happen with this new version of code is if somebody typed import sample, you would see the code load, and then you would see these messages saying, oh, you're adding logging to these functions. And then if I called the function, you would see the log message show up. It's cool. It's like you've made this like little modifier to the code. And again, by doing that, it becomes very easy to change what happens. Like if I don't like the log message, I can come over here and change that. I could say, well, you called that. So you have a different format for the log message. I could change it to use the logging module. Essentially, the logging code, it's all in one little place. The code that's over on the left doesn't need to concern itself with the details of that. It just knows that there's logging turned on, and how it actually works, not really a concern. This is the decorator idea, that you can put this wrapper layer on there. Now, there are a few technical details I have to warn you about here. One difficulty with doing this wrapping is that these wrapper functions that you create do not look like the original function, at least not in a proper way. For example, if I look at sample add, the functions don't really identify themselves in a meaningful way. Like if you look at it, they just all come back saying, I'm wrapper. That's a little weird. Also, you'll find that things like help messages don't look right. Like if you do a help on it, it will just come up saying, you're wrapper. It doesn't even show like a proper signature of the original function. This is kind of an annoying facet of that. And one of the ways that you have to fix that is if you're defining a wrapper, you need to copy information over from the original function. Like you might copy the name over. You might copy things like the documentation string over. That's another thing that gets lost, by the way. Like if you had any of these functions with a doc string, like that help message would get lost in the wrapping process. So in order to fix it up, you need to copy things over. It turns out that this process of copying things over is so common and so error prone that somebody actually made a decorator to do it. So this is part of the Python standard library. What you should really do if you're defining decorators is there's this thing called wraps from func_tools. And what you do is when you're defining the wrapper, you tell it that you're wrapping this other function. What that will do is it will copy metadata. It'll copy like the name of the function, the documentation. The result after doing that is that you get functions that look a lot nicer. Like if you look at sample.add, it just identifies itself as add. It says it's sub. If you do a help on it, it will produce things like the correct signature for the function. It will show you the documentation string. It will look nicer in the environment. In fact, it will be less obvious that somebody has applied a decorator to it. So this is kind of the basics to get started. If you want to write a decorator, what you're doing is you're putting a wrapper layer around a function. And if you've ever seen the @ sign syntax in Python before, that's what it's doing. It's defining a function and wrapping it with something else. In the next part, we're going to talk about some more advanced aspects of this, but this is enough to get started with some simple decorators.